Is the Woman of the Hour, the Golden Globe winner, SAG and Academy Award nominee, Lily Gladstone. Well, I thanked these folks for joining us on this lovely Tuesday evening, but also thank you to you, not only for joining us on this lovely Tuesday evening, but also for this incredible performance, this performance that truly is in tribute, not only to Molly, but to so many women. Every time I watch this movie, I'm just reminded of all of the women whose stories never get told. And I know that that is a concept that's incredibly important to you and to the work that you've done. So as you kind of have these moments of standing ovations and historic things, what does it mean to have this reception for this film and for Molly and her mother and her sisters?
Yeah, that's really the heart of it. I was just visiting with sorry to name drop, I was visiting with Kate Blanchett this morning. And talking about that moment at Cannes, the first ovation, and what it felt like to watch the film. It was my second watch of it, but my first time with an audience, and feeling the weight of what everybody else was experiencing watching it together. And what I found, even though we all made it together, I found myself really falling in love with Molly, separate from anything that I have to do with her. It's like I already fell in love with all of her sisters in the making of it. But to feel the audience make those discoveries, to get to meet each one of us, to get to witness her loss of each one of them, which, went unrecorded in history. There was brief mention when I was looking through documents with Leo and early research at the Osage Museum, looking at the court transcriptions. There was barely mention of Rita in the trial about her death, about her house being exploded. It all focused on her husband, Bill. It was, these moments where you really have access, or you feel like you have access anyways. You can access empathy for these stories in a different way when you're seeing it spelled out by a masterful filmmaker. And I found myself just experiencing all of that almost like the first time with everybody. And it just moved me when there was that very first eruptive applause for everything, and the elation that all the native cast there felt, all the Osage that were present felt, the way that, I don't know, just how good it felt to, when the camera turned to the sisters, just like how much it uplifted all of them, and then turned to William Ballou, who played Henry Rowan, and he just lets out this war cry, which was so awesome, and it just resonated around the world. Like every Indigenous person on TikTok the next day was like, "Look at this guy!" But it was this collective celebration of what felt like an historic moment because of that new way of accessing a story like this, that increase in visibility immediately. And I know that I carried the performance, but that rapturous applause really felt like it was for Molly Kyle, because she was so much the access point in this story of humanity, So yeah, I think from day one, when I was offered the role by Nobody's Design, it was on Molly Kyle's birthday. So from the very first moment that, because I had trepidation about, during the audition process, there's not so much like, oh, what if I don't get it? It's, oh God, what if I do get it? What is this gonna mean? So when that happened, and truly I asked by Nobody's Design, just maybe by Molly's Design, I told myself, It was an immediate reminder that this is why I'm here. You know, Molly's somebody's grandma. Molly's somebody's great grandma. Molly's several people's great great grandma. It's you know, her impact is felt, and it's shared, because the story, even though the federal case only investigated a couple dozen of these murders, there were hundreds and hundreds of Osage people died during the Reign of Terror through mysterious means that were never solved. There's, you know, this continued epidemic of missing murdered Indigenous relatives that's directly tied to this history of erasure, of invisibility. So to have these moments of increased visibility, even though it's a film, it's, you know, it humanizes in a way that this medium has historically dehumanized us. So it just feels really incredible that people are connecting to the Kyle sisters, their story, their bond, you know, not just their trauma, but their resilience, their beauty, like their relationship to each other. And I just have endless respect and relief that Marty was so moved as a filmmaker. Every step of the way, the lens would shift, the story would change, and that ending, like being left with this final image of Osage people today continuing forward together the way that Native people we always have, through uplifting each other, through holding to tradition, to allowing that to carry us forward. And yeah, just
I appreciate so much that you mention just the humanization that we get to see of the Kyle sisters in this, because perhaps my favorite scene in the movie is that scene where you have just the four of them together kind of gossiping after church and discussing their men and what is to kind of to come and deal with them. When you have those moments, because there is so much to come, what do you remember about those takes all together as you got to kind of embrace the lightness of their relationship and what they meant to each other?
I love that scene so much, for so many reasons, but it's precious to me, it's precious to all four of us, because we wrote it together. There were lines there, they were in English, they'd been kind of translated into Osage or some like version that was trying to get at what the lines were saying. But as we got more comfortable with our Osage language teachers, who were really, you know, there's this process of, you come into the community and they're like, oh, there's those actresses playing the Kyle sisters, you know, and I understand people come to my community, come to Blackfeet country all the time. We have beautiful landscapes, very filmable, and people, the way that like people in the industry engage with local res folks is not always great. And especially because we were there talking to making a movie about the Reign of Terror. You know, of course there was like an element of suspicion about all of us, but we got invited pretty quick into a family's living room for ceremony. And like, that's where you really are just yourself. You know, you have to just leave artifice at the door when you get invited into these circles. And I could, we were in ceremony with the descendants of Henry Roan, who he's, you know, Henry had a lot of kids, a lot of grandkids, a lot of descendants, and everybody traces that line really clearly and just is protective of this story, protective of him and his image, because a lot of times stories haven't given him the level of humanity that this story did, that William Ballou really fleshed out in his portrayal of him. But yeah, when we were there, I could, you know, one of our harshest critics as a film as a whole when we walked in is former Chief Jim Gray, who was Henry Roan's grandson. And now Jim is one of the strongest defendants of the film. He and he told us, like, when we were there, just seeing who the four of us were, how we felt like we could be part of the community. It's like they saw four Native girls who are all touched by similar histories, because the Osage Reign of Terror is specific to Osage. The incredible oil wealth is exclusive to Osage. They were the richest people per capita in the world at the time. But the story of being resource rich is not unfamiliar to all Native peoples. There's some precious resource in all of our lands that we, we experience similar things. I mean, California, we're in California, the state that was shaped by the gold rush. It was so hard on people here. We all know what it is to have this status of incompetency of our own funds. Native Americans are considered wards of the United States government. And for decades and decades and decades, for over 100 years, if you did have lease money, if you did have money coming in from resource development or what have you, surface grazing, that would get forwarded to the Treasury. It wouldn't make its way into Native households. So we all have these stories in our families, in our communities. And I think when communities started identifying us as Native actresses, it was a little less, rather than actresses who are Native. Then there was like this openness. So when that trust was established, people became candid. They felt like they could say to us as actresses, it's like, these lines we got in the script, we really can't translate them. They don't translate into Osage thinking or Osage concepts. I'm like, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. So then we approached Marty about it, and we also knew that for each sister, this was our one scene, all the four of us together. For Jillian, it was one of two scenes that she had. So when the four of us got together, we're like, this is Jill's scene. The rest of us have other scenes to play out throughout. So, let's give her the good comic relief line, and Jillian herself has got a really great, wry, surprise you kind of sense of humor. So she brought that in. We all got to stamp the personalities that we pulled out for these women, for these characters, and put them into the scene. So it was just tremendously bonding, the four of us getting to sit in Jill's living room and write it together. And then when we handed it back to our Osage translators, our teachers, they were like, yeah, this tracks, we can totally translate it. And people really enjoy that scene. We had a lot of fun shooting it. And then on the day, it was the same thing. It's like we were very mindful of each other's coverage, very mindful of how much weight each one of us had in the story, and wanted to bring that all out. I think it was important to all of us, particularly, that scene make Minnie, the youngest sister, so precious, because she's the first one we all lose. And she's the first one I was watching how she was working as well, because she's dying of this wasting illness that so many Osage died from during that time. And so I knew that everything that Jillian was creating, every foundation she was laying, were clues as to how it was going to affect Molly later. Yeah, I agree. It's my favorite scene, probably. I wanted more scenes like that. I think every single one of those actresses deserves to have a very long, wonderful career.
And it's also a scene that's kind of part of underlining something that it feels like is very important in this story. This idea that Molly is not, the wool isn't pulled over her eyes completely. She recognizes that Ernest this is a trickster story. I know you've spoken about that a bit, that, he is something that is not totally to be trusted, but she has a blind spot for him. Tell me a little bit about why it's so necessary and relevant, really, to show her agency as well, that she's not just like a silly woman who falls in love. She's a woman who falls in love, and that creates this dangerous situation for her.
Yeah, thank you. It was, we really didn't want to, we wanted to give Molly as much dignity as possible, which was a task for Leo, to make a character like Ernest that lovable. One thing that I think it's not explicitly stated in the story, and it might take a couple of watches before it really clicks, but the idea of this incompetency of this guardianship program. You meet Molly in her guardian's office, itemizing all of the ways she's spending her own damn money. And he's signing off on it or he's not, and turns out skimming some for himself off the top the whole time. She eventually took her old guardian, Pit Speedy, to court and got about $7,000 back from him. But the fact that Osage's men and women needed to be appointed a white guardian of their money, it was of great convenience if you were married to your guardian. So there was reason to date white men, and like Ernest wasn't the first white dude that Molly had dated or had like courted. She kind of looked into one and it wasn't right. Someone he's crying about in the car. Heard you went with Matt Smith for a while. When she's giving him the 20 questions, part of it is, calling out this trickster nature that he has, but she does in a way like have his number. Like, I was being taught Osage on coyote stories. When she calls him Shomigasi Coyote, it's not just the animal, it's an Osage trickster figure. They have several tricksters, some are more sinister than others, but Coyote is the hedonistic one. He's the one who, as Ernest admitted to her in that first date, for lack of a better term, like to make a party at night and sleep all day. Sure do love that money. Oh, I love whiskey. It's like that's Coyote. And when you grow up hearing these stories, we have our trickster stories in Blackfeet that I grew up hearing, and I mean, our trickster figure is different, but a lot of the shape and movement of the stories is the same. When you hear them as a kid, you get kind of the PG version of it, and they're funny. Like, these stories are really funny. You find yourself rooting for the trickster, even though, like, as you get older, you realize these stories, as they shift and grow, they, like, trickster's actions, they're not good. A lot of them are not good. They can be funny, but they're always self-serving. They can, usually in these stories, they don't win in the end. They don't get what they want, but it doesn't mean they don't hurt everybody in the process of trying to get it. And ultimately, trickster stories, a lot of times they can be seen as light and funny, but they're like the fabric of like what shapes our world and how we understand our world. They're an ultimate reflection of ourselves and our own humanity, what's in each of us. So I think without meaning to really, because that was never explicitly stated, it became obvious to me hearing trickster story after trickster story in my Osage language lessons. And eventually it was just like, I asked my teacher, Chris, is it okay if I share this story with the filmmakers? Would that be all right? And we asked elders, we asked other language teachers, we asked, because you don't want to put cultural stories out there for public consumption. And there is a version where we did shoot Molly and Ernest sharing a trickster story with their kids. Ultimately, for whatever reason, that story stayed protected and stays with the community. And it also kind of like tips your hand to the rest of the narrative, go figure. But yeah, Molly having a sense of who he was already was, this is an entertaining person. I can handle this person. And really, she was also seeing, she says it, it's like, yeah, he's not that smart, but he's good looking. She kind of needed him to not be that smart. Osage women are matrilocal. Everything's owned by the woman. Every say over what happens with the money is the women. And that stretches back to like trapper trader days. Like, men's responsibility was to bring it home. Women decided how to divvy it up and what to do with it, which ones you keep, which ones you sell, and then men go off and sell it. But it's women who sort through all of that, and that was brought over from the woodlands when they moved to Oklahoma, and it remained when it became oil money instead of pelts, instead of everything else that Osage traded with him for. So yeah, this really complex love story does have origin and complexity, and they did end up falling in love. Like, to a degree, it was just acknowledged this is a marriage of convenience for both of us, but we enjoy each other's company. And then it just takes on a whole different level when there's kids. And you see, from what Molly could see of Ernest, even if her subconscious mind felt a threat coming from inside the house, so to speak, that would be coming from Hale, not directly from him. There would be worry for him. It's laid out in the first scene too, where he's scared of your uncle. Like, there's an awareness of his nature. And there's a sense of self, that you get. It's just classic codependency. Like, I can be their safe space. I can be a safe space for this damaged little boy. I think a lot of us are probably familiar with that dynamic. But then, when you see a man that's so committed to his kids and so just loves his kids, you don't ever suspect they're going to bring danger around them to that level. And, that's part of the big betrayal. It's also just Native families, when you're in, the biggest, Leo and I both took a big leap of faith that we would find it, because it's one thing to hear it. Margie Burkhart, Molly and Ernest's granddaughter, stood up at this dinner that Grey Horse District had hosted for Martin Scorsese. There were 250 Osages from Grey Horse District, where Molly's family is from, who were there and voiced concerns that they had with the film and what was going to be shown. And Margie stood up and just said, to add to the complexity of what these stories actually were, she said, you have to remember Ernest and Molly loved each other. And even in me and Leo's first meeting with Margie knew that, but she was skeptical that there was a way of showing it, that it was something that we would be able to do. And it's like still skeptical, like I'm sure all of you are feeling watching it. It's like, was that actually love? Was there real love there? Where we found evidence that it must have been real. People don't remember Molly. She passed in 1936, and she kind of kept to herself after all of this. So there's nobody alive that really remembers her. People remember Ernest because after he got out of prison, he moved back, and he showed up to things. He stayed in the back. He didn't engage anybody. People remembered him as being kind of a quiet, reserved person. But he would show up and just kind of take in the community. And, nobody engaged him. He was basically dead to everybody, but he kept showing up. Even after the trial, after he got out of prison, after he moved back to Osage County, his son, Cowboy, who stayed very close with his sister, Lizzie, they're remembered as being very fun-loving. They would host parties. They would have lots of people over. They loved a good time. Kind of tips you to what their early childhood must have been like in the home. When Cowboy was with people, sometimes he would get a little somber and, look at the clock and, oh, excuse me, everybody, you got to go pick up old Dynamite now, meaning his dad. It was a nickname that Cowboy gave Ernest, was Old Dynamite, after, clearly blowing up the house. So, just that sense of humor. But then he'd go pick up his dad, and they'd drive around. He'd take him to the bank, he'd take him to the grocery store, he'd look after his old man, until one day he just stopped. He didn't. But all of those things just were very clear evidence to me. Also the fact that Ernest spoke Osage. Not every white person who married an Osage learned their language. And that was to be able to communicate with Molly, to be able to communicate with her family. And, Ernest wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. So you think about the machinations of, Hale learning the Osage language. Hale wanted to be Osage. It wasn't just enough to have the wealth, the money. He wanted the identity. He wanted the claim to land. He wanted the claim to indigeneity that you see a lot of people who romanticize who indigenous people are, want that for themselves. So Hale's learning of Osage was a very different thing than Ernest. And that was evidence to me too. It was, when I watched it, Leo was the first person I texted, and I was like, oh my God. How did we do that? We did it. And I think because it's not clean, it's not simple. but it was. It's just, it lived in the real world, this impossible relationship to believe was a loving one, but it was.
As we wrap up, I do want to ask you one more thing about just everything about this arc is so nuanced and incredible. And Martin Scorsese, of course, has said, a lot of it lies in the silences. But I want to talk about one of the louder moments, the scene in the cellar. I know each of, honestly, Molly's traumas was approached differently, but it's my understanding that in blocking this scene, it came from you, this idea that Molly and the kids would be down in the cellar. Tell me a little bit about this moment as her last living relative, as Rita, as her life quite literally explodes in front of her. What did it take to accomplish a scene like that for you?
We walked into that one with the script as it was. Everybody was a little, off joint about it, offset about how, because at that point you have a whole film behind it, and what's on the page doesn't necessarily work as well. As it was written, we were all sitting in the living room, and then Ernest comes back, and then there's a slow punch in on Molly's face as she's realizing what happens, and then it's intercut with a voiceover from the train station. I ought to kill these white men who killed my family, and then started a whole other voiceover into the next scene. So when we got there, Leo and I were visiting about, it feels weird to just be chilling in the living room. This is a big thing, and it's like we'd already shot the explosion. We saw what the force of it was, the glass blowing in. It's like, all right, this isn't just like a boom, what was that? This was big. And then it's like, okay, so how would we take that? I mean, the Tulsa race massacre had just happened, and we're a non-white community that's wealthy, so stands to reason that maybe we're being bombed. So I just simply, when we were there solving where would everybody be, all I said was, well, where would we go if we thought we were being bombed? And then I said, where would we go in a tornado? Is this a real house or is this a set? No, we're in a real house. Okay, does it have a basement? Sure enough, it did. So that's where we restaged it. And then that scene as it is on the film, or in the film, was supposed to be an establishing wide shot. Marty and Rodrigo were just figuring out how to rig this dolly up these old creaky stairs to punch in on Molly as a scripted. So that was the first take. Just when I wish I could say I'd planned it, but I didn't. It was that realization, and tied to this other idea that Molly's last words to her sister came from an Osage man in the community, Wilson Pipestem, who says the exact same thing to his younger sister Veronica, and it's indicative of Osage view around women. You're blessed when you have a daughter. You're blessed when you have a sister. That's your wealth. It's might be the richest people in the world per capita, but women and sisters are where your wealth is. So the last words that Molly has to Anna in the script reflect that. You're my wealth. And then when you see that, you hear these stories about the stock market crashing and people throwing themselves from the rooftops of buildings in New York because they had no more money. It's what would that be? Losing a sister, yes, but the weight of losing all your sisters, all your wealth, screw money, this is my whole family. So there was that element of there's nothing that feels big enough for this moment. Janae Collins, who plays Rita, is my actual flesh and blood cousin in real life. It's several generations removed, but it's very clean in our family line. Her great-great-great-grandma was my great-great-great-grandpa's auntie. She was his father's sister. And, we know that. We keep family record. It's oral tradition. It's documented because it has to be by the government. But, Janae and I bonded because she's the one who told me that when we were shooting together. And I'm very aware of who her great-grandmother is. She's an incredible woman named Medicine Snake Woman, not Tuista. Deserves a movie on her own, and Janae needs to play her. But yeah, like that. Like I have that familial bond with Janae anyway. That really became apparent and formed making the movie. And just her laugh, my God, she's got the most infectious laugh of anybody I've met in my life. And just the thought, briefly, of never hearing that again, it just came out. Like, that moment on the stairs just came out. Surprised me, surprised everybody, clearly surprised the kids. And then, you know, when it was done, you just hear Marty's little footsteps just pops up by the camera, and his eyes are full of tears. Just, we don't need to punch in. We don't need to punch in. Do another one for safety. And just okay, Marty. But yeah, that moment was so much just being present in the story, figuring where we were in all of our character arcs. What was on the page didn't fit anymore. So it was just, yeah, I mean, one of those moments where the film gods kind of show up and just like gave us a house with a cellar, gave us the thought, you know, because my first time on set, I was like, okay, oh, there's a bathroom. Oh, this isn't a real house. Walking on set, I had no idea which houses were real and which ones were built. But,
well, we have to also thank you and really thank the film gods for giving us you, because that only happens when you have an actor who is so present and is paying attention and truly just thank you for the beautiful work, and thank you guys. We could really